The thing is that Ingold's perhaps one of his most famous statements about anthropology that other anthropologists quote sometimes, either with disdain or approval, is that Ingold said that anthropology was philosophy with the people included. And so it's philosophy, it is about the world, what philosophers do, but it's actually talking to real people about it. And I don't know if he changed his mind. That was one of the first things he said. And you see a lot of philosophy being thrown around in this class. I'm not a big philosophy person. I'm more like a people person. Not that I like people, but definitely don't like philosophers. Anyway, this chapter is really hard. I did contemplate, should I skip it? Maybe I can X out some pages from it and we could skip those. But there was just enough little stuff in it every time it went along. I couldn't skip ahead. This stuff, Ingold is short in comparison to things he's critiquing. And this is the shortened version of philosophy. This is as short as you can get. So the thing is that to understand this chapter, and maybe I should have said this from the beginning, you have to understand that Ingold is critiquing a concept that has been used and got apparently very hot in museum studies, which was the assemblage. Nowadays, the idea of the assemblage is very much in vogue. There it is. I think that's the back of a high heel. A must-have accessory for every aspiring theorist. And by the way, every aspiring theorist should definitely get those heels and walk around and knock. So yeah, now we're talking. It's in vogue. Well, how many of you are aspiring theorists? Nobody raised their hand. So there are departments of anthropology and whole graduate programs that are populated by the people that I would call the theory heads, and they walk around with, and mostly, for the most part, in archaeology and biological anthropology, these people don't really exist. They usually exist in like linguistics and cultural anthropology, and they walk around with their really big heads and they talk theory, and they are aspiring theorists. And sometimes they do have cool shoes. I was not one of these people, and I mocked them, but I was raised on more of this maybe than we get. At Hartwick, who would you say, what was the closest thing that you've had so far to this class? I might be the only one, my other class. Which one? Cultural? Yeah, we touch on some of those things. Yeah, I did want to make cultural more into the prep for a class like this, but anything else?
Political science classes.
Political science comes into a few different varieties. There's the bean counter, statistics, political science people, and then there's the political theorists. And yeah, they're often going off and throwing in some Aristotle, and sometimes their stuff will look very, yeah. Dalton he reads a lot of the theory side of anthropology too. Anyway, so Ingold is critiquing this. He's going to be critiquing an idea that is in vogue. And I looked up and I said, is this still in vogue? And it's still in vogue. It maybe is going a little bit. The theory heads, they move on a lot. They go from one accessory to the next pretty fast. It's still around. Its main exponent is a person that Ingold mentions, or one of his main exponents named Manuel de Landa. And he wrote a book called Assemblage Theory. There you go, a whole book. Probably a lot of words in that book, Simi. Maybe more than word count. And I was looking at his work a little bit. He wrote an earlier book called 1,000 Years of Nonlinear History. That's a cool title. And the reason why assemblage and assemblage theory is popular or in vogue, or what people are drawing on it for, is trying to get to an explanation of how things that are around us, how things got to be the way they are. So 1,000 years of nonlinear history, without resorting to a couple explanations which we usually use or have used for the way things are. For example, since we have a historian here, in the olden days, how would we have said things got to be the way they are? Like, who would we have looked at in history for explanation of things?
I mean, my impulse is to say
God. Okay, yeah, all right. Well, that's a good one. Yeah. Let's go back to the very old days and we would say God. So that's a very, what we would call a teleological, theological view of history, which is ordained by God as the person, well, the entity which has ordered history. And the sort of, but if it's not God, well, what the historians did is they got rid of God and they put a couple other things in. Where they substituted somebody else for God. Like when we used to study the wars and stuff like that in history, who do we always look at? Why do you have to? We don't have to do this anymore. We used to have to memorize all the battles, the battle of this, the battle of that, and who was the prime mover of the battles? Well, you want to know the winner. The history. The winner does write the history, but who's the person who's winning? Who helps us win the battles? We're gonna get to the French. The French are on deck here. You just keep the French in mind. Keep the French in mind. Well, I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about we. Alexander the Great, but like. No, good. That's right. Alexander the Great. You're on track. Yeah, that is an answer. Oh, okay. We would think about the generals, the Napoleon, the generals. Yeah, there you go. There's some French. It's the great man theory of history. And so you would learn about the big people. Yeah, the great man theory of history is actually a thing that we used to study. You'd learn the generals, you'd learn the battles, you'd learn about the great people who shaped history. And so in some ways, an assemblage theory is nonlinear. It's trying to get away from that idea. And it's also, it is true. It's supposed to getting away from the linear view of history as leading to redemption or God or whatever it is. But it's also trying to get away from the idea that everything is overly structured and overdetermined. And that's what Deleuze and Guattari, those French guys we're going to talk about in a little bit, that was their appeal in the 1970s. And in this title, you can see that Delanda has a lot of debt to Deleuze and Guattari because 1,000 years of nonlinear history is a little bit bothered from 1,000 plateaus. Right? So 1,000 years, 1,000 plateaus. So anyway, I'm just saying that this is still in vogue and there's some reasons for why people might want it. And Ingold also mentions another prominent theorist in this that uses the idea of assemblage, Jane Bennett, in her book, Vibrant Matter, A Political Ecology of Things. And this is a political science person down at Johns Hopkins, she's a political theorist. And is representative of what Ingold calls the new materialist, or maybe even she calls herself a new materialist. She probably has cool heels too. Oh, like her glasses. Yeah, I know, they're in vogue. Yeah, exactly. A must-have accessory for any aspiring theorist. Interestingly, look at that cover of the book. Maybe I wish I could get better focus on that. What do you think what is that stuff there? Stones, all but separated. That's an interesting image. It's very archaeological. It's earthy, but this person has never touched the ground. They have nothing to do. I don't know. I'm making things up, but they're off in their theory land, but they're using these images from archaeology and rocks and stuff and trying to get us to think about the materiality of things and getting all into that. So, but they're very into the word assemblage. Now, Ingold tells us that actually there's two different ways that the word assemblage gets imported into our vocabulary. One is purely from just people who do touch rocks all the time, like geologists and old people, and back in the day, those very like that 1790s old people, and culminating in a use in archaeology by the archaeologists Rosemary Joyce and Joshua Pollard, who Ingold cites here, Archaeological Assemblages and Practices of Deposition, which is a book chapter from 2010. And so for the archaeologists, the assemblage is just the stuff that's together, and they go on about exactly what that is. But that's one tradition of the assemblage, the common sense tradition, you might say, that arose through geology and archaeology and the ecological sciences. But there's, of course, another tradition which comes from these guys. and the French. Now, we've seen these guys before a little bit. Every time they come up, I squirm around because they're very difficult to understand. Deleuze and Guattari, there's a picture of them giving a conference. I think one of them was a psychoanalyst and the other was a historian. I'm not sure. The French, they're everything. I like this picture too. Yeah, so they emerge in the 1970s in France, and Ingold likes them in some ways because they get away from the excessive structuralism which was present at the time, that everything was in some ways the structural anthropology of Levi-Strauss at the time had locked things into place, and they're more about fluid and nomadic thought and these things. And they wrote a couple of giant books. Their most famous, their second book, is Mille Plateaux. Now, as Ingold says, this on page 269, this poor translator, this was the 1970s, he did the mammoth undertaking of trying to translate this into English and give us 1,000 plateaus, capitalism and schizophrenia. And like, can you imagine how long it must, this talk about word count. This book is super thick and it's all in impenetrable French. And there was no Google Translate. There was no, there was no way, you couldn't do anything. You just had to sit down and just write it out. And so, yeah, it was a mammoth undertaking. And for all that, all he gets is like little writing there. Brian Masumi, poor guy, I do feel for him. So he does this mammoth undertaking to translate Deleuze and Guattari into English. And the irony is, so what Ingold says is there's an interesting irony here, is that it's Masumi who translate the word agencement in French into English as assemblage. And so the later people like Delanda and Bennett are using Deleuze and Guattari and drawing on this translation and talking about the assemblage. But as Ingold says, Deleuze and Guattari, writing in their native French, never used the word assemblage. Why not? Actually, it is a word that exists both in English and in French. It's a word in French and English. So why not use assemblage instead? It would surely have saved a lot of trouble and confusion had they done so. So it's like, well, what were they doing? Now, I want to pause here before I say what they're doing and talk about translations from French into English in general. We've seen a couple of these so far. Bourdieu, for example. People couldn't understand what he was saying, but it's worrisome. We don't know if that's necessarily because he couldn't write very well or because the translation is bad. And then we saw that On Habit, that famous essay that Ingold was talking about, was left untranslated for like almost 200 years before it comes into English. Levi-Strauss too. So I told you about Levi-Strauss and that in some ways his writings were crucial in getting rid of or challenging the idea of what Trujillo called the savage slot, or the idea that people in civilized societies had different kinds of minds or brains, mind workings, than those in other societies. And as I mentioned, Trujillo, Michel Rolph Trujillo, was a Haitian French and Creole speaking anthropologist. And so he probably read Levi-Strauss's La Pensée Sauvage in the original French. And so he said that Levi-Strauss was crucial in being one of the people who most broke the idea that the minds of the people in other societies were fundamentally different than the so-called civilized mind. But in English, this book was translated as The Savage Mind by Claude Lévi-Strauss. Now, if you picked up this book in a bookstore like I asked you to do with Ruth Benedict, what would you think? What would you think you were getting? Yeah, I mean, it'd be like, oh, great, I'm going to explore the savage mind. Now, admittedly, there's a little bit, at least the thing says there, a world-famous anthropologist demonstrates the complexity of primitive systems of thought. So at least it's trying to say that he's demonstrating the complexity of their thought. But yeah, you'd pretty much say this was bad. It would not impress on you that all minds were alike. You'd think the savage mind. So actually, this is a pretty severe mistranslation, though, or a version of what Levi-Strauss was trying to say. It's actually recently been retranslated and given a more akin to the original French meaning, which would have been wild thought. At least it wouldn't like savage mind you, right? You know, at least it's wild. It takes a little bit. Wild thought. So it's a new translation of La Pensée Sauvage. And it also rescues the pansy. The pansy is critical here because, in fact, the word pensée in French means thinking or thought, but as its like third or fourth or fifth meaning means a pansy. That's actually how we got the word from. So there's like a little doubling here. Anyway, it would have been nice. So it was mistranslated into English and then borrowed as an assemblage. And Ingold says, well, they should have, why didn't they just, if assemblage was all they meant, why didn't they just use that word instead of choosing the word agencement? And why, or what are these new materialists doing? Are the new materialists, in their infatuation with a certain genre of philosophical writing notorious for both its prolixity and its penchant for juxtaposing incommensurable elements culled at random from here, there, and everywhere, merely bamboozling us with their verbose neologisms? This is pretty surreal. The funny thing, I don't know what that means. I find this hilarious. Maybe you're right. So let's just make this. Are these theorists who are infatuated with philosophy that is notorious for overwriting and putting together a bunch of things that don't belong from every which way, only bamboozling, we can use that word, bamboozling us with their overly wordy neologisms, new words? Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree with you. I personally haven't seen Ingold done better as because he's engaging with a whole literature that's coming about both in and beyond anthropology. And he's engaging with some of the most fundamental ideas of anthropology. The relationships between humans and nature, the relationship of anthropologists to the people they talk to, and what the practice of fieldwork entails and what you're actually supposed to be doing in the field. So I certainly wish I would have read more Ingold before I got to the field. I'm sad. I would like to go back and throw a lasso around and stuff like that. Just being attentive more to process and what you're trying to get out of when you are doing things with people, and what it is you're looking for and talking to them about. It's in some ways because you have a certain brand of anthropological theory that was done. Well, let me put it to you this way. What is Ingold trying to tell? What is Ingold asking here? This is a serious put down, actually. But who's he putting down? Yeah, he's basically saying they're bamboozling us by making up a bunch of new words and being overly verbose. Now, Simi would say, and I would too, that you could maybe condense this down into like one little tiny sentence and say they're too wordy and like they're bamboozling us. But when he follows that up, the next sentence is very easy to understand. He has that long sentence and then he just says, to a great extent, I think they are. That's only 6 words. There you go. In fact, there was only like 2 syllables.
They are what?
They are bamboozling. Are they? Yes. To a great extent, I think they are. So
You're being bamboozled by the new material.
You're being bamboozled by the new materialist. So, but this is where Simi is absolutely correct. What's he going to do instead? No, he's going to say that he is going to introduce the other side of assemblage.
I just kind of ignore this.
Or that you can have, you need the gathering part. In order to have an assembly, you need the gathering.
Gather the stone, build the wall.
So that what he's trying to do here is introduce these two adjacent concepts, which are related to each other, but different, and that you need one without the other. He's not trying to invent new words. Every so often he will. He's just trying to explain these two things. And remember, it all goes back to a very simple question. What does it mean to join things? Oh, I forgot. I have a physical exercise for us to do in this class to join things. I don't know if that's going to be so slow to cut that. I should have cut it myself, but I was reading your answers and trying to deal with your objections to the class. Deal with the haters. All right, so let's do the first exercise. The points are now connected up, but now suppose that each of these points be set in motion. As your hand moves the pencil, its point describes a line. How then might you join these lines, think them as threads? So now try to join up your threads too and compare it to your network, and then we'll have a nexus.
So like a line of threads.
So just join them up into a thing so it goes out like this. There's a bunch of loose ends around. I don't know. Just have fun. Back to shutting off your light.
Okay, I'm ready for my.
So these are two different ways of joining things. You got your network and your nexus, which is like the assemblage and the gathering. You're going to have your network on your piece of paper and eventually a gathering. That looks so nice, everybody. Yay, a craft. Actually, maybe we should have done this for the next class. I thought it was an important exercise. I just wish I would have cut up all the string before, so you had the chance to assemble it.
Well, I technically did it wrong on purpose.
We'll give out an award for the best nexus and the best network. So another way to think about this, it goes into the Latin, and I thought this was fun. Silas said you were almost there too. So both of these prefixes in Latin mean to join, but in slightly different ways. So he contrasts if you adjoin things or you conjoin things. Actually, this is one of my favorites, things that add here and things that cohere. And then especially this one, the difference between an aggregate and a congregate. And so Ingold is saying here that both of these words mean to join, but they just have a slightly different inflection or a slightly different way of thinking about it. And he says it's like at-ness and with-ness, or transverse. I shouldn't say versus. Transverse is like your horizontal line, and then your going along line, your longitudinal line.
I don't know. I was also kind of confused at this part.
Yeah, no, but I thought your sentence and your quote was very good. Like, it involves time, and it's about when we come together into an assembly or an aggregate, the congregation, when we become a congregation, we're taking our stories with us over time, and then as we will be going along. So again, Ingold is looking at these things as related concepts. He says they are not the negative or the opposite of each other. It's more like a 90-degree shift in or orthogonal. So you have your horizontal line and then your going along line, and they're related to each other in this way. And you're right, he does go on and on about this, but he's trying to deepen the metaphor of what, in order to have an assemblage, you need also this gathering part of things. He, of course, says that this is like a correspondence. And then he goes off. No, he's not him. He's somebody else who goes off in the woods and stumbles on those stones. He may have been anthropomorphizing the rocks a little bit, but the point is that they're not just there individually by themselves. They're rubbing up against each other. They haven't been put there necessarily by somebody, but they have arrived there. They have their own story of how they've arrived. Maybe they've been swept there by water or something, but then they're jostling each other. So they don't just exist on their own. Ingold also uses the metaphor of the thing and a shadow. So you can't have a shadow without a thing, but they're related again, it's 90-degree level. So the assemblage would be the thing, the gathering is the shadow. So I went looking for images of things and shadows to show you, and I found this. That's like it. All right, there's a new season coming out. I also found this picture. Wow, that's even better than I thought. So actually, though, this is from an article. The reason why they do it like this is it's because of an idea of quantum shadows, in which these physicists are saying the mystery of matter deepens. Forget particles and waves when it comes to the true guise of material reality. What's out there is beyond our grasp. I wanted to read this, but then I got paywalled off. But it was the reason I found this interesting as an example of what Ingold is talking about is because he then does talk about a difference between a way to think about reality and about things. So he cites this book by an archaeologist, In Defense of Things, Archaeology and the Ontology of Objects. There's an aspiring theorist for you there. And according to Olson, he believes in the chunkiness of matter, that things are concrete and offer stability. And Ingold's like, well, sure, but in the gathering, you have both accretion, the addition of things, but you also have this concrescence, where things are coming into being. And as we've talked about, in a world of concrescence, all is flux. So everything is continually generating and everything is in flux. But Ingold says it's important to note that that doesn't mean that everything is liquid. That's different. It's everything being in flux, that everything is to a certain degree, in a state of the solid fluid. And he says that ironically, that is exactly like concrete. So when we remember the tuna, and I said that's my most concrete example, we use concrete when we mean something that's hard and out there and in the world and very solid. But in fact, if you look at concrete, it's, well, in one of his more dramatic statements, concrete is concrescence because it is liquid and you pour it in the water and then it firms up at the right moment and becomes concrete. So there you go. The next time you are passing by a building site where they're pouring some concrete, you go out there and say, concrete is concrescence. Try not to get hit. Don't do that in the field. You're right, Cyrus. You don't want to apply that. It's an interesting way to think about the concrete, though. And then he starts talking about bricks and brick walls and what you can do with bricks. You can do different things with bricks and mortar than you can with stone. So I decided to think about these bricks for a little bit. You can make arches out of bricks. This is a picture of I went to high school in Exeter, New Hampshire, and this was the library.
High school?
And I was a boarding school. Yeah. This library, I didn't realize it at the time, and I didn't I wanted to be here. I didn't appreciate this library at the time. I had my work-study job in this library, but I didn't appreciate how truly beautiful this library was.
I like this library.
Yeah, so this library was designed by the architect Louis Kahn. And some people would come to campus and just go up there and take pictures of this library and then walk away because it was one of the cooler buildings. And so you can see here the combination of the brick and the arches with inside, yeah, you'd have these concrete. And it's a little bit better in photos than in person. If you have to work in there, you're like, ugh. But it is very cool. And I bring this up because there's a movie that I keep having to chase down the uncopyrighted version on YouTube. They keep posting it and chasing it down. But there's a film called My Architect, A Son's Journey, which is made by the son of Louis Kahn. It's not that he was the unacknowledged son, but it was like his second family. And so he's trying to go look for his dad, the architect, but he's not his official son. So he's trying to retrace his steps. I wanted to show you this because Louis Kahn, in some ways, in his thinking about these materials and what he was trying to do at the time, I'm not going to show you the whole movie, is very similar to different ideas that Ingold is having here about the relevance of the materials and how you seek to understand materials. I have to track this down, and this one has Spanish subtitles because they haven't figured out that it's the movie. All right, so in some ways, quite similar to you ask Brick what Brick wants to be, which sounds a little bit goofy, but architects of the day were starting to think about being true to the materials. And again, this is something that very much applies to how we design things and how we think about things in the field. All right, now stone walls, perhaps our most important image. This is actually a stone wall from Hebron, Connecticut. I'm always fascinated with, you'll be walking through the woods in New England or even around here, and you'll trip across a stone wall. This is an image from a person who wrote a whole book about these walls called Stone by Stone. It had to do with the stories of these stones, which is very important. They don't just get here. Well, these stones, they probably dragged them from the edge of the field so they could, like, why did people make these? Yeah, they were property demarcation, but why would you, in what kind of landscape would you make a wall like this? What were these New Englanders trying to do with these walls?
To like clear their fields for crops.
Yeah, this is for agriculture. So actually, this person's book says that he says these walls were part of an agro-ecosystem, and now most are part of a woodland ecosystem. So you'll be walking through the woods and just trip over one of these walls because the agriculture has, for the most part, gone away, and the forest in different ways is back. But Ingold here talks about the story of the stones have a story before they come into the wall. And then there's all these other things that happen around the wall, like moss and plants then start to grow and grow over it. But what's going on here? What might we ask when we trip over this wall? Let's say you're running through the woods and all of a sudden you trip over a wall. What's your first thought? Why is this wall still here? How did it make it here? This is all overgrown and I was just going for a run and I've hurt myself because I tripped over this damn wall. So why is this stone wall still here? And you mentioned some other places in the world, like when you go down to Cusco and see the ancient city, these Inca walls are still there. Yo, okay, yeah. Why are they still there? It's amazing. They didn't use mortar, they just fitted all these things together. Some of them are so well fit together you can't even stick a sheet of paper between them. And what's interesting, if there's an earthquake, like all the Spanish architecture and the modern architecture will get devastated. These Inca walls just stay. They're just there. Yeah, eventually they might go away, but for now they're still there. So at the end of this, Ingold says, well, he's basically, yeah, Tyler, why is the wall still there? Who is he drawing our attention to? The builders. And so it's this idea that to have this assembly, this you might say is an assembly. It's almost smooth. It's actually very assembled together. But in order to have this assembly, you had to have these builders coming in and making the wall and putting all these things together. In this case, in an incredibly intelligent way. This looks a little bit just piled on, but they've done a good job because there it is, still there. But he's asking us to pay attention to the people who are involved in the building of this wall. Now, for the most part, he is still criticizing the new materialists. He says that basically their problem is they think about assemblage, and the reason that he's annoyed with them is that the assemblage is just like this collection of things and they don't tell you how it got there. Whereas you need this other part, this gathering part, the activities of people to understand the other side and how this got there. So that's what he's most doing. And that's when we get to the end of the chapter. He says, the next time you stop to admire a wall, spare a thought for the labors of those who made it, and whose ghostly presence still lurks in the interstices amidst the deepening shadows of the stones. So the stones are starting to settle in and clump on top of each other, and that's what gives them their internal coherence. But it really is important that they had these labors. So his main critique is of the new materialists and this weird philosophical use of assemblage. And so he wants to expand our notion of this by giving us the gathering and the shadow and the labors. But he took this in a slightly different direction. Yeah, it struck me, this first sentence, the next time you stop to admire a wall. When was the last time you stopped to admire a wall? No, we don't, because there's no reason to. Why would I stop to admire the wall? It's just a wall. There's no reason to. I'm going to stop to admire a wall if it's out there and I'm running along. I'm like, oh man, this is amazing. It's still here. But for the most part, we don't need to stop to admire the wall because it sucks. It's just a crappy old wall. And so, yeah. I don't want you to go over here and be like admiring the wall. I want you to get back into like the old style of things, not in a nostalgic way, but getting back to that original meaning of things. It reminded me of something that's been going around a little bit these days. So this is the McDonald's. This is the McDonald's that I grew up with in the 1980s, where there was color and there was trees and there was life and there was happiness. And this is the McDonald's of today, which looks like you've gone to prison and you never have to talk to anybody and just order things on your phone, and then you pick them up and you stare at a giant screen while you're staring at a little screen. It was a little scary when that tree was talking to you. Yeah, that the whole, what were half of those folk tales were about just scaring the shit out of the kids. The Grimm's fairy tale, those things were. Yeah, I looked around a lot for this clip, but I couldn't find it, so you'll just have to remember it. Have you ever seen the Lego movie, the first one, the very first one?
I know the Lego.
The Lego movie, good. I was looking around for this scene where Emmett is there and there's a master builder, and like it's the whole scene where it's like the idea that we've talked about this, you do things from a kit and you just assemble it. And in that scene, like it's all about like using the glue to glue everything together, which Ingold discusses here. Yeah. And so, but then the master builder, it turns out, is just like doing things as they go along and are able to do all this cool stuff without needing the instructions. I could not find that scene, but I meant to.